What other thing you're getting at? Woo!
Yay. We have a guest speaker this evening. Our second favorite alum. We don't have any favorites. T-shirts. No, you're not an alum yet. Everybody's T-shirts ordered. I think that asked for a T-shirt, or that I told you we'd get a T-shirt for. I don't have a lot of announcements. I was going to try, and we may be able to do this real quick since the opposing party's not here yet. What did you think about the street preacher?
He was a jerk.
Ew.
I was a jerk.
Did you read?
He was a heretic.
He was preaching false gospel. That's the best way to say it.
Well, he had a lot of truth, but and a lot of misconceptions at the same time. Like God is the ultimate judge, but He doesn't hate you.
He also said that if you're a real Christian, you'll be perfect and never sin, and if you do, you're
Okay, so maybe he had some
you're a
misconceptions.
condemned hypocrite going to hell, and they laughed at you if you were. So
He also said that we were communists and godly women belong in the kitchen and they are supposed to stay.
Well, that was accurate.
That was accurate.
yeah, they were calling women whores
I'm
as they
pretty
walked
sure
by.
that
And
that's not accurate.
They also told a chick that was hanging out with a Muslim that she was going to hell for hanging out with a Muslim.
Oh, and one girl that was wearing a crop top, she was called a whore, and that she was asking for rape.
So, you think that was wrong? The way he was doing it, or going about it, you think that was wrong?
If he's not showing love, what you're preaching is not true.
Did you read the anonymous blog that I shared?
Yes.
The I am sorry thing.
Yes.
It was kind-hearted, it was sweet, but
Did you read some of the quotes after, or some of the comments after?
I read a couple of them. What's the difference in what he was doing and what the blog says?
I didn't read it because it was too long.
he was all condemnation.
At least you're honest
I
about
read
it.
about the first two paragraphs.
He was all condemnation. They're all full grace. They're like, so he's going full truth, but forgetting the grace of God. They're going full grace, forgetting the truth of God.
I agree.
There was some cherry picking going on both. So.
Yeah, definitely cherry picking.
And there are actually 9 things that Christians are commanded to judge. Believe it or not.
At least.
And one of those is faulty scholarship.
What?
Anyway, I wish I would have been here. I'm sorry I missed it. I wanted to hear your side of it, and if our other guests would have been here, I wasn't going to be able to bring it up because it would have turned into a full-blown discussion for the next hour, and we have other plans besides that. So you saw both extremes. If you read through the blog, you will see some contradictions in there. I mean, one of my pet peeves personally is when you see a brother or sister saying, "Judge not." I don't think people that are followers should be saying "judge not" personally, because we should be able to take that verse in context, and we are to hold each other accountable. So, take "judge not" literally.
Verses 7:1 through 7:5 are a complete unit. So
Right.
if you take verse 1, it sounds like you're not supposed to judge. But to paraphrase Jesus' words, if you want to judge righteously and not have it thrown back in your face, then get rid of the hypocrisy in your life.
Yeah, don't
But
be,
people leave that last 2/3 of it off.
don't be calling a street preacher out and going down on the corner and calling people whores and communists. How's that?
The other big irony is that little meme that we posted. They cherry pick laws out of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but there's also a law in Deuteronomy that says don't mix 2 types of thread in the same garment. So if the street preacher is wearing his underwear, he's mixing 2 types of thread, so he's as unlawful as the people that he suggests. The whole thing's just a big mess.
Which here lies the problem with or the point I was trying to get across. It's like,
Did you know that?
No.
If you mix 2 kinds of thread, then you are breaking one of the 613 laws.
Yeah, I've been told that
So
by
he
some
who
people
breaks
like,
one,
"You're a Christian."
according to Paul, breaks them all. So if you got up and put socks or underwear on today, you're already unlawful before God.
Aha! Flip flops.
we're not going past there. Anyway, the point I was trying to make was I wanted you to look at both extremes, and I think you stated it well as far as he was going about it. Not only was he sharing a false gospel, but he was going about it in a way that is not real effective. There will be some street preachers here next week.
Same one?
No. They're from a ministry that will show you probably a way, if you happen to run into them or see them. I don't know where they're going to set up. I think it's Appalachian Ministries. Anyway, their plan is to be here, WVU, Virginia Tech, and somewhere close, 4 campuses. Point being, they're going to present a way that you've not seen this guy do, and probably more in a way that would be beneficial. But at the same time, you got the other side looking at us, because people, from what I understand, that are professing followers getting angry and upset with him, and then try to call him out, do these things, and then you have the other side that don't believe anything. They're calling it bad. And I'm like, what are you basing it on? Because bad doesn't exist in their world. But the other side of what the blog is, the extreme that went to judge not, and how do you handle these type of situations? Do we apologize for other Christians? Because if we are, then I feel like we should probably be doing that a lot.
Yeah.
Me included. So, anyway, think about that. If you want to go back, give us time, read the blog. So you all don't seem to think is as anonymous as I do. Regardless, it went viral to an extent. So whoever wrote it made some people very comfortable, which comfort's what it's all about. Anyway, this coming Saturday and Sunday, Matt Rawlings, if you're watching, this is free publicity. Christ Community Church in Portsmouth is hosting J. Warner Wallace. He wrote the book Cold Case Christianity, Forensic Faith, Something for Kids, God's Crime Scene. He's a converted atheist. He was a detective in Los Angeles that investigated cold cases. He was on Dateline NBC, and he does a very good job. And he will break it down to where it's very understandable. Church, street preacher, Jim.
Yeah, Jesus.
What a concept. And I'm going to let Isaac explain this. I'm not even going to go there. I'm not even going to go Jesus on this introduction. I was going to try to embarrass him, but I'm not. Isaac is our second favorite because I have no favorites. I've used that since I was a recruiter, because I used to have people waiting to go to the Air Force, and I would tell them they were my favorite person waiting. Anyway, it's a long story. Isaac's highly intelligent. He has a bachelor's degree in molecular biology. He learns more than I'll ever know in some things. And if you get him upset, he does take to heart some things that we've discussed here. Certain terms. He's going to talk about intelligent design.
Yeah. Well, if you have been with us the past 2 weeks, you've already got some of this
stand
stuff.
that far away.
I'm not going to. I'm in the chair. Then you have already seen some of the stuff that I'm going to cover this evening. I know I actually had a little difficulty coming up with the way I wanted to do this, because I know that not all of you have biology backgrounds. I mean, technically, if you had a really good biology teacher in high school, then you could follow some of the stuff I'm going to say this evening. But I can't count on that, and then for a lot of you, that's probably a little distance back. But since we've started out with Mark, and he kind of introduced the idea to you that there is more out there than simply a young earth creationist viewpoint. He talked about different Christian perspectives on how to look at the evolution debate. And then last week, John actually took a step back and talked about some issues that come up when you're talking about science and faith in general and laying a foundation for this. We're going to look specifically this week at what's called the intelligent design movement. And the reason that we're bringing this up is because some of you may be a little fuzzy on how that term is properly used. What's the difference between what I'm saying this evening and what Mark talked about in that first week? Isn't creationism and intelligent design, isn't that all in the same mold? And in some sense, yes, it is. In some sense, it's not. So let's go ahead and get started here. Those pictures are out of order. Hit it 4 more times, or 3 more times. All right. So I don't care what it is that you're talking about, but in biology, it's very easy, whether you're a specialist, an atheist, or Christian, it's very easily to kind of be captivated, to look at what you're studying and say, wow, that looks incredibly designed. I don't care if you're talking about the DNA molecule that is literally code that looks like some of the codes that we as humans use to run machines. I don't care if you're talking about a bacterial flagellum, which quite literally has the parts that we use to build motors and boats. I mean, it's a little motor inside a cell, and it goes back to some of the most primitive life on this planet. Whether you're talking about this protein right here that is in plants today and actually converts sunlight to energy with an efficiency that is better than any of our solar panels that we have today, or maybe you're thinking about the human brain, which is more complicated than any computer that we have. I mean, it's very easy to study the things in biology and think, wow, this looks designed. And, you know, that's not just an admission on my part. That's also, that's also our friend Richard Dawkins here. He's Tobin's favorite Christian apologist. And he said that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And obviously, if anyone thinks that things are not designed with a purpose, it is Richard Dawkins. So that is something we constantly have to keep in mind when we're studying biology.
Blind watchmaker. I was going to point that out. That's what we ended with last week, and everybody looked at me like
Oh,
deer
yeah.
in headlights.
That's from his book called The Blind Watchmaker. Yeah. All right. So what we're going to do, though, is I want to back you up, because even though obviously we know there's this big intelligent design evolution clash today, I think having a foundation for where it came from is actually going to help you understand the debate today a little better than what you may have had before. So most of you are probably aware that if you're talking about in history class the Enlightenment period, when you go before that, you're very much talking about times that were dominated by a Judeo-Christian worldview, which means there are a lot of people that were just outright creationists, not in the sense that we use the term today, but very much believing, taking the Bible at face value, what it says, and explaining how life got to be that way. But there was also some combination of Christian theology with philosophical ideas. And when you look at some of those ancient philosophies, they actually de-emphasized, to some extent, studying the natural world. I mean, it's, you know, studying lowly things like dirt and animals just wasn't very becoming. And so that kind of hindered, I guess, progress in the field of biology itself. But there was this idea of a God that created things with a purpose for a large part of our Western history. And so then you get to the Enlightenment itself, and that's when we get this idea of empirical thought. And so there becomes a much greater emphasis on what you can observe with your senses. This is where the scientific disciplines kind of took off, because we threw off those ancient philosophies that devalued the study of the natural world. And so even the scientific revolution, though, was in large part founded by what Christians believe, because, you know, they valued studying God's creation. And once they had the freedom to throw off the philosophical shackles of some of those ancient philosophies, they were able to start what we know as the scientific revolution. And so, but what emerged from this wasn't a strong Christian picture of science. It actually eventually started leading people more academics, I guess, more away from the faith in some sense, because once you can start coming up with all these things in science that work, the idea is, well, what if we just depend on the stuff that we can observe and see that works? So the laws of nature. Then all of a sudden, you can still have a picture of God, okay, but it's more of an idea of God as creator, someone who's set it all up. And so you very much get this, what some people have called kind of the clockwork, the machine picture of the universe, where God kind of sets things up and lets it go. But the point is that there were some, you know, it seemed like little by little, reasons that people had for believing in God were kind of vanishing, okay? So you got to throw off the shackles of revelation. Just because the Bible says it doesn't mean you have to accept it. And even some of the arguments that people use for the existence of God, people started questioning that. So, you know, why do we need God to explain the universe? What if instead of having eternal God, we had eternal universe? And the laws are enough to explain everything we see. And so what there was, though, what you find out is when you look at this time period, there was one last stronghold for arguments for the existence of God and even specifically personal design, and it was the field of biology. Because it didn't matter how much you thought you could explain about the universe, it was pretty darn hard to explain away the amazing details of apparent design that you see both in human beings and just the world around you. And so biology very much was a last stronghold, but obviously, if you're the last stronghold of something, all the enemies are going to be coming in at your gates. And so slowly, bit by bit, we did start chipping away from the idea of design in biology, which is when we get to Charles Darwin. Now, he was not someone, as you guys may think that Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution, but you got to realize, before Darwin, evolution was already in the air. There were lots of people before Darwin that were proposing theories of evolution and change over time, including Darwin's own grandfather. He actually had his own version and theory of evolution, but it was Charles Darwin that actually made the observations and paired evolution with the idea of natural selection. And when you put those two things together, you had a much more powerful and much more explanatory theory than anything that had come before. And so because of that, plus all the promotion that kind of Darwin's inner circle was doing, you started to have his theory take off in a way that other theories of evolution had not done previously. So you can get the next one. I don't need to explain some of that. Here's a guy you may not be as familiar with. And if you are, that's fine. But how many of you have heard of Alfred Russel Wallace? I've heard the name Alfred Russel Wallace. He is actually the co-founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection. You don't ever hear his name because Darwin, this guy kept traveling around the world, whereas Darwin was kind of in his spot and he was able to publicize his stuff. He had a bunch of people in his inner circle that promoted it with his name on it. But this guy came up with the same ideas of natural selection and evolution by natural selection at the same time as Darwin. And he was actually influenced by several of the same things that Darwin was influenced by. So you can see why they both came to the conclusions that they did. And he actually knew Darwin. So he wrote a version of his theory and sent it to Darwin in 1858. Now, you guys know that Darwin published The Origin of Species. Well, guess what? He had already come up with his idea and he was writing his book, but he hadn't published it yet. And so when this guy sends Darwin the letter in 1858, the idea is, oh crap, I've been sitting on this way too long. This guy's about ready to steal all my thunder. And so that's when that kind of gave Darwin the impetus he needed to publish his book on the origin of species. But here's the thing that I find interesting, and this is why I want to bring this up. We've been dominated up to this point by very much intelligent design mentality, even in the field of biology. And Darwin's about ready to try to get rid of that. But even his co-founder of the theory of evolution, Alfred Russel Wallace, it turns out when you read his writings, while he was not a Christian, he did not believe that evolution was capable of explaining all aspects of life. In fact, he said that there were some things, and in particular some of the stuff that I read was his focus on the human intellect, that he said there were some barriers that he thought were just too big to be crossed by evolution by natural selection. And so even at the very founding of the theory that we now today attribute to Darwin, it turns out that one of the founders himself was appealing to some kind of intelligent design within the theory of evolution by natural selection, certain things that he just didn't think the theory could explain adequately. And so I think everyone here is probably familiar with this, but let's just make sure that we're all on the same page what evolution by natural selection actually means. So if you have this population of, I guess we're talking about birds here, and you're going to say that they feed on different kinds of seeds, okay? So you've got, notice here that they all have different beak sizes in this first picture, and that all helps them feed on different kinds of seeds. Well, the point is that after you start to reproduce, you're going to get these random variations in beak size. And that's just because random variation comes up in population. It comes up in human populations. It comes up in bird populations. When you see populations reproducing, they're not all the same. They're going to come out with some variation. And so, what happens when you start having limited resources? Well, the point is that not all those birds are going to survive. And so, if you have a certain kind of seed that is more numerous, and so you have a certain bird that's better at getting into that kind of seed because of their beak size, what's going to happen is those birds are going to get more food, they're going to be better fit, they're going to survive, and therefore they are going to reproduce more, obviously, than the birds who were not as good at getting the food. And so in the next generation, you're going to have a much higher frequency of birds that have that beak size, because those were the birds that reproduce more. And so this idea is that as variation arises, natural selection, the survival of the fittest, is going to make sure that over time this population changes. It's going to be changing from one kind of population to another, and it's all based on this natural selection picking out these characteristics that allow one to survive better than the competitors within your own population. Let's get that one too. And so here's what happened. That's the idea. That's what Wallace and Darwin were both promoting. And it turns out that this is an idea that caught on. By the end of Darwin's life, I would say that most people in the scientific world had accepted at least some version of his theory. Now, obviously, you still had creationists at this point in time that were accepting literal views of the Bible that said that is not, we can't accept this version of the theory. And honestly, there were actually some scientists that were upset at this point. But for the most part, this was what was needed for the world to be captivated by the idea of evolution and at least believe in some sense that a theory of evolution was how we could explain the origin of how we got here.
I was going to say, can you touch on, for clarification purposes, this evolutionary theory versus origins?
Yes.
Where the birds came from?
I've got a slide on that. We'll get to it. Okay, but here's the thing. Even though that was at the end of Darwin's life, it turns out there was a period in the scientific community where Darwin was eclipsed. And now, make sure you understand, I don't mean that evolution as a theory was discarded. But you got to remember, evolution by Darwin was evolution by natural selection. And there was a period from about the 1870s to 1920s where scientists started saying, okay, we don't really know if Darwin's version of evolution is correct, because the more we think about it, the more we realize we don't really know if he can explain the variation. Because you see, natural selection works really, really well when you have a constant supply of variation in your populations, both in your, well, I won't say genetics, because that time they weren't too worried about that, but in the biological traits that populations have, the forms that bodies take, the structures that they have. If those are all varying over time, the natural selection works swell, okay? It's great. It can do a lot of work. But then we start asking the question, okay, we just kind of like assumed that this variation is there and it's always there and we can explain it. But when you think about what Darwin believed, it didn't make sense. Because Darwin, and this isn't Darwin's fault really, but because we were still very much in the young, early stages of the field of genetics at that time, but he didn't have a proper view of genetics. He thought that he subscribed to some kind of blended inheritance. So that would be like, if you have a red flower and a white flower, they're going to produce pink flowers. So in other words, you're always taking whatever traits of the parents they have, and you're going to mix them together. But the problem is, if you just keep mixing traits, that doesn't lead to variation. That leads over time to everything being more and more similar. And so it doesn't seem like Darwin's ideas about inheritance were very compatible with what he believed about all this variation showing up so that natural selection could actually work. And so until the scientific community got on board with a proper view of genetics, they really weren't that interested in Darwin. But even then, you guys know, like I said, this goes back to like high school biology, but Gregor Mendel and his pea plants, that's where you get the proper view of genetics. But even then at first, people were confused, like how do we get this source of variation? Because here's what Mendel observed. If you take a green pea plant and cross it with a yellow pea plant, it turns out in the next generation, one of the things you can get, and I don't think I picked the proper, yeah, I guess I did. One of the things that you can get in this generation is you can get all yellow plants. Okay, so why is it you go green and yellow and then all you get is yellow? But then, even more of a surprise, when he breeded those yellow ones together, guess what he got in the next generation? He got green and yellow again from just yellow parents. And so the only way to explain this from Mendel's perspective was, okay, maybe instead of genetic traits just blending together, you get a trait from mom, get a trait from dad, and they're both together, but maybe one dominates the other one. So maybe yellow always dominates green. So that way if you have a bunch of kids that have yellow and green, they're all going to be yellow. But then the next generation, you could give some of the kids that have two green ones from both parents. So they're going to be green. So these are genetic factors. And you'll notice I'm talking very ambiguously right now because I could use the language of DNA to describe this because we know what's happening, but Mendel didn't know about DNA at this point. So he was literally calling these things like these are genetic factors that parents have. I mean, it was very ambiguous. And so, but the point is that scientists did eventually get on board and they're like, okay, this Mendel guy had it right. But now, how do you explain variation like this? Because if you get a green factor from mom and a yellow factor from dad, and then you just keep passing those on, where do the new ones come from? How did that green get there in the first place? How did the yellow get there in the first place? Where does the variation come from? This just seems to be capable of mixing around variation. It doesn't seem very capable of explaining new variation. So even after Mendel, people were still wondering, can Darwin's theory actually explain this variation? So, of course, this is in the 1920s, so this is when the creationist controversy arises. You have the Scopes monkey trial in America, and you've got the fundamentalist movement in full swing, and they're kind of battling out at this point. It's all against evolution versus creation, whether that was educated discussions taking place or not, I'll let you decide that. But then something happened in 1927. We actually discovered, if Mendel is right, we discovered how we can get variation. It turns out that genetic factors don't just stay the same over time, you can mutate them. And so we found out that we could hit a bunch of flies with x-rays and we could make them produce all kinds of mutated babies. And so it turns out that whatever it is that is genetic in you, remember, they don't know it's DNA at this time, they just know there's something genetic. If you can mutate it, you can cause brand new variations in species. And so here it is. Was this the magic bullet? All of a sudden, Mendel's account of genetics, it works. We've got these new experiments that show us we can have mutations, which will cause genetic variation. And so now Darwinism is coming back in full swing, because what we thought couldn't be explained before, all of a sudden it seems like the scientific community is saying, okay, we think we can work with this. And so what that was, we call this synthesis of Mendelian genetics and some of those mutation experiments. All this came together to create what is known as neo-Darwinism. In other words, it's a renewal of what Darwin's thought was. And this was happening in the 1930s and 40s. And it was also where we saw the birth of what in biology we call population genetics. So now these are the parts that we've talked about in this class already. When you're talking about evolution, there are three different aspects of modern evolutionary theory that you need to realize. The first one is just descent with modification. And that's the idea that just like the birds that we talked about, populations over time can change. And it's based on the variation in their population and what traits are confer survivability, what ones don't, what ones cause greater fitness. And then if you can trace that back, if you say that there's a long enough time that those mechanisms work, what if we can't just explain variation within populations, but what if we can explain the variation between populations? What if they actually can all be traced back in a line? And so you get this big idea, and Darwin had this idea himself. It's in his book, the Tree of Life. And so that was the idea of common ancestry. All organisms today are descended from the common ancestor. And then finally, the idea of like what causes this, what is the thing that causes it? Well, now we know it's mutations causing variation, and natural selection keeping the good things around, getting rid of the bad ones. And so that is called the neo-Darwinian mechanism. Yeah, go.
Between the ape and man, if evolution says we come from apes, where is it between the ape and the man?
Well,
where they claim the?
Well, let me stop you right there, because we've already talked about this when Dr. Mays was here. But this picture right here is not an accurate portrayal of human evolution, and that's acknowledged by creationists, intelligent design proponents, and evolutionists. Okay, it's interesting. This is one of the most popular images of evolution out there, but this is not a good representation of what modern evolutionary theory says about human evolution. So you can criticize this picture, and it's probably all good criticisms, but just realize that it's criticisms that everyone agrees with. So it's just overall a bad picture. One of the reasons I put it on here, though, is because this was also a time, we're still in the 30s, 40s, 20s to the 40s era. So we're starting to discover a lot of the human fossils that are in contention here. And so this picture is starting to develop in this time period because we're finding Neanderthal fossils and different things like that. So that's why that picture's here during this time frame. But this is the forward picture of Darwinism. But we still have one more clarification to make, because remember, at this point, all you have is genetic material, and you know that it can have mutations in it. We don't know what the nature of it is. So that's when you get to 1953. Watson and Crick, they actually discover the structure of DNA. By this point, we've shown that DNA actually is the genetic material. But this actually throws some people for a loop, because if you look at how DNA is structured, I mean, obviously it doesn't have actual letters. These are just letters for the names of the bases. But if you zoom in on the chemical level, you can see the atoms and stuff. This is our picture representation. You've got G's goes with C, T's go with A. I mean, it's literally a code. Okay? If we look at DNA, and all of a sudden, now we understood that mutations cause genetic change. But once we get to 1953, now we can explain that. What is a mutation? Well, it's when you're supposed to have a T right here, and instead of your cell putting in a T, it puts in a G. Okay, it's a copying mistake. And this quite literally looks like a code in every single one of your cells. In fact, we have over 3 billion of these base pairs in every single one of our cells. Okay, so this really was a game changer, because now evolutionists are celebrating this because they know how evolution works. They know how mutations work. They know where the variation comes from. Intelligent design proponents and creationists are probably also celebrating, because they're like, man, this looks an awful lot like a code. Does that point us to some kind of designer? I mean, you're going to see where the arguments start to develop from here. So what happens, and this is just so that this is brushing you up on those that, if you don't remember some of your biology stuff, but when you have DNA, this is like 2 strands and all the letters are matched up. If you want to copy it, so you maybe have one cell and it's splitting into 2 different cells, what you do is you just split up one DNA molecule, and then you copy both sides, and you put in the matching letter on each side. So what you end with are 2 DNA molecules that look exactly like the one you started with. But occasionally mistakes are made, and so that's what a mutation is, when you put in a wrong letter. And it turns out that most of the mutations that will occur in your DNA and other animals' DNA, most of those mutations actually aren't harmful. They're neutral. They just kind of build up. They don't hurt or benefit you. And then occasionally there's a beneficial mutation, but then if we're talking about beneficial versus bad mutations, there's probably a lot more bad mutations than there are beneficial, but the vast majority of these end up being what we call neutral mutations. Now, this is how this works, because this is very important for you guys to understand the rest of this, and especially where intelligent design is today. You need to understand, when I say DNA is like the instruction booklet for your cells, you kind of need to know a little bit of what that means. So what does it mean that DNA is the code for everything? Well, let me start out by saying this. Every single cell in your body has the exact same copy set of DNA. Now, I want you to think about that, because that should immediately make you start thinking, well, okay, my skin cell is not the same as a cell that secretes acid in my stomach. That's not the same as one of my brain cells. It's not the same as one of my heart cells. I mean, how is it that every one of my cells has the exact same DNA, but they're all different? Well, the reason is that in your cells, you guys know that you have genes that control certain traits. Well, some genes are turned off in your stomach cells that are not turned off in your brain cells. And so your entire genetic code in every cell is expressed differently. And when I say expressed, what that means is DNA provides the code to build proteins. And those proteins are what are going to make your cells different. That's going to make your cells do different jobs. It's going to make them metabolize things differently. Some of them may be built especially for storage. But proteins in your cells are one of the, not the only, but one of the main things that make them different. And it's also what makes your cells different from cells in the animals around you. So, you know, you have some of the same cells that animals out there do, but they're not the exact same. I mean, you may have, your brain cell is not going to do the exact same thing as the brain cell in a rat. And so this differential expression of proteins, or this making of the proteins, and right here I've just got a link. You know, proteins are made of amino acids. That's why when you drink your protein shakes, if you're looking for good protein shakes, you look for ones that have all the essential amino acids and stuff, because those make up proteins. So what the DNA does is it codes for those different amino acids in a certain order, and you can link them up, connect them together to make certain proteins. And so that's what we mean. That's definitely not all we mean. In fact, this is actually a very small portion of what your DNA does. Very little of your DNA actually makes proteins, but it's a very important part. So that's what we mean when we say DNA acts as a code. But this is where people got to thinking, okay? So some of these people were not very friendly towards Christian religious ideals, but you still had scientists at this time starting to think. This was Murray Eden, and he was a professor of engineering and computer science at MIT. So not a biologist, but still people like him are thinking at this time. He says, no currently existing formal language can tolerate random changes in the symbol sequences which express its sentences. Meaning is almost invariably destroyed. And what he means by that is imagine trying to improve a book. If you have all the sentences and stuff, imagine trying to improve it by making random changes and keeping the good ones and getting rid of the bad ones and then making another copy. I mean, most of you realize that, at least for a book and in our language, that is not going to ever improve function, even if you have some kind of natural selection looking out. Because when you have these kinds of sequences, they don't tolerate high degrees of change like that. And so at this point, we begin asking ourselves, we know that DNA functions something like a language. It functions something like a code. But is it exactly like the human language, or is it kind of like a computer code? What is the DNA actually like? And so this is a conference that met in 1966. These are not by any means what you would consider friendly, intelligent design, creationist Christians. This was some top scientists from around the world meeting at what was called the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia. And so the title of this was Mathematical Challenges to the New Darwinian Interpretation of Evolution. And so basically the idea was, even if you have all these different kinds of mutations that scientists know about, is it possible to introduce those kinds of random changes to language or code without inevitably degrading the function of that particular code? Is that possible? And a lot of these guys at this conference were very skeptical as to whether it was. Now, that brings us up to, during this time, 60s and onwards, you start having a lot of commotion, okay? This is where your modern young earth creationist movement developed. You had Henry Morris coming out with a book called The Genesis Flood, which sparked the current young earth creationist movement. You had the founding of several old earth creationist ministries. You had a bunch of court cases about whether we should teach evolution in school. And it was actually starting in 1984. There was a series of time for about 1984 to 1992 where we got what we now call the modern intelligent design movement. Okay, and so this is not creationism. This is the common criticism lobbied against intelligent design, that it's actually just creationism in disguise. And it is true that creationist intelligent design proponents use many of the same arguments. So you might be able to say that if you have something against an intelligent design proponent, you've got a good argument against a creationist too. But they are not the same, because intelligent design as a movement is not interested in religious texts, religious traditions, or resolving any tensions you have with your personal faith. They basically, an intelligent design person will say that I think that there is scientific evidence within DNA itself, within life itself, within biology itself, to suggest a designer, an intelligent designer. So in other words, you're not basing that because you believe in God. You're not doing it because you're a Christian and you're trying to prove that God has designed everything. Now, is it true that a lot of intelligent design proponents are Christians? Yes, it is. But the fact is that the idea itself is built on the idea that science, the scientific data, can point us to intelligence. Whether we can identify that intelligence as God or not does not matter, and it's not a question that they concern themselves with. So you had all these books started to be published, and intelligent design kind of came on the scene as we know it. Now, what is it that distinguishes intelligent design from other movements? The fundamental premise of intelligent design is that what the genetic mechanisms that we see at work today, like mutations and the different kinds of chromosomal arrangements, it cannot explain the genetic diversity of life that we see on Earth today. So without some kind of intelligent input, if all you have are natural mechanisms like mutation, you cannot explain the genetic variation that we see on life today. That is the fundamental premise of the intelligent design movement. And so this is why some people are a little shocked, but intelligent design proponents sometimes accept common ancestry. There's no official position of the intelligent design movement as to whether we all came from a common ancestor or not. Some of them believe it, some of them don't. Where they all unite is that they believe natural mechanisms left to themselves cannot explain the transition. So you may say we all came from a common ancestor, but still say that that would in no way be possible if there wasn't intelligent input along the way. So that's why intelligent design doesn't really take a position on common ancestry. Let's go ahead. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because Mark has already, he hit some of this in his talk. But I want you to see that there's a variety of positions here. If you have a young earth creationist perspective, obviously you believe in a creator, you believe that there's purpose in how life developed, you believe that God actually had a role in bringing life about. There's a special creation of the different kinds of animals that God created, and you believe that the universe is young. And so when you look at how that works, the old earth creationists are pretty similar. They believe all of that God created everything, that God had a role, that God designed these different forms of life. The main difference is that they would accept the current scientific consensus about the age of the earth. But then notice over here, you still have 3 more positions that believe in a creator. And a lot of times you're going to find Christians in all 3 of these. But the point is, I want to show you where to draw the line for intelligent design. Most people would consider, if you're a young earth creationist, old earth creationist, then you are in the intelligent design camp because you believe in an intelligent designer. But if you are in a directed evolution category, you also believe in an intelligent designer because you believe in common descent, so common ancestry from a single ancestor, but you believe that there was intervention and purpose along the way. Now, there are other people who believe that there was a creator and evolution happened, but they don't believe that God had to intervene for that. They believe that maybe God foreknew ahead of time that evolution would happen, and he set up the world like that. But in terms of the actual evolutionary process, God didn't touch it. He just let it go, even if he knew where it was going to end up. So people who would fall into that category of planned evolution, most of the time they will not identify themselves as intelligent design proponents, even though you can see that there's a sense in which they are, right? If you believe that God kind of set up the universe for life to evolve, in some sense there's intelligent design there, but that they would not claim intelligent design because that label has come to be associated with these 3 groups right here. And so that's why this debate gets a little confusing, because you've got people in all these different camps, and they don't always explain to each other what they mean by some of this stuff. So here's what we're going to do. This is kind of the last part of the presentation. I did all this because I wanted to show you something. What is it that the ancient Judeo-Christian traditions of our culture had in common with the founders of the theory of evolution, Alfred Russel Wallace, had in common with the scientists who started to reject Darwin's version of the theory after he published it because he couldn't explain variation? What did they have in common with the people at the Wistar Institute who said that we don't think mathematically that Darwinism works? And what do they have in common with the modern intelligent design movement today? What is the common thread that draws all these together? And the answer is that fundamentally, these have all had some version of intelligent design in mind. Maybe not necessarily intelligent design in the case of the Wistar Institute, because they were more just presenting challenges to Darwinism. But the idea is you need information to get this variation, to create life as we see it on this planet today. And that information is not going to be able to come from natural Darwinian processes. Now, this is important because there's going to be a debate, a little later, and this is what John was talking about earlier. There is a difference between how life originated and then how life evolved from there. Okay, so when you're talking about evolution, that does not mean you're talking about the origin of life. Because you can say that you have no idea what the origin of life is, how it got there, and still think that evolution can explain how we got from that first life to the genetic diversity on the planet around us today. Now, intelligent design arguments, they will apply equally against a naturalistic origin of life scenario, as well as a naturalistic theory of Darwinian evolution. Okay, so that's why intelligent design, they try to keep their eyes on both debates. But just keep that in mind, that when you are talking about evolution, don't criticize evolution and then switch to the origin of life and then think that you're still in the same topic, because you're not. If you wanted to pick a topic, pick it, stay on it. But those are two separate issues that you need to worry about. And intelligent design proponents will present arguments in both cases. So here's the first one. DNA encodes functional information. Go to the next slide. What do we mean by that? At this point, I'm going to tell you what the intelligent design camp has, and then I'm going to tell you some of the most common critiques against it. So this isn't even a talk to persuade you to be a proponent of intelligent design as much as it is me informing you about where the debate is today. So this first point is, I want you to see that in languages, so whether it's written or spoken, in languages you have specifically arranged characters that are going to convey some kind of functional information to conscious agents like yourselves. So I can say something and I expect you to hear it a certain way and maybe even have a response from it. If you talk about computer code, you can have arranged characters in computer code, like the zeros and ones, your binary code, that are going to produce some kind of outcome of functional significance, and that's going to be within the computational environment. And so that doesn't have anything to do with conscious agents, but it is still a very specific kind of information. And so here's what I want to say. There are lots of different definitions out there of what information is, and they mean different things. And not all of them point you to intelligence. But I would argue that whatever kind of information these two things are, they do point you to intelligence. And I think that when we look at how DNA works in your cells, it is very clear that it is much more like these two definitions of information than some of the most commonly proposed definitions out there that may or may not point you to an intelligent source. Because you see, DNA stores and conveys functional information for building those proteins and RNA molecules, and it has to do with the precise arrangement of its characters, which in this case was the bases that I showed you. And you have to have that specific sequence to produce a specific effect. Now that sounds very much like these two kinds of information right here, even though we know these two kinds of information really only come from intelligent sources. Now, first point, that's the point the intelligent design proponent makes. If you want to have an evolutionist, a Darwinian, counter you on this, it's going to be a dispute about whether DNA is actually that kind of information or not. Okay, so there, like I said, there are different definitions out there, and if you can make this fit a definition of information, like DNA information, that doesn't necessarily point to a designer, that would weaken this argument. So, I'm just going to read you some quotes here just to show you that this is the kind of language that even scientists use. This isn't from intelligent design proponents, this isn't from Christians, this is just giving you an idea of some of the language used. So since the genetic code was deciphered in the 1960s, scientists have assumed that it was used exclusively to write information about proteins. UW scientists were stunned to discover that genomes use the genetic code to write two separate languages. One describes how proteins are made, and the other instructs the cell on how genes are controlled. One language is written on top of the other, which is why the second language remained hidden for so long. I just want you to, even if you don't understand all that, I want you to see the idea that this is being communicated like it's a language, just like I mentioned before. And then this one says a new study from an institute in Sweden shows that the grammar of the human genetic code is more complex than that of even the most intricately constructed spoken languages in the world. So this isn't something that just intelligent design proponents are coming up with. Now this is the second premise that an intelligent design proponent will kind of put forward for you. This says that no known natural laws or chance events can produce large quantities of functional information. And in order to illustrate this, I'm going to give you the example of a bike lock. So what I want you to think of is if a thief is out there he's outside of Marshall where the bikes are kind of tied up, he's wanting to find a bike to steal. If he finds a lock that has 4 dials on it versus one that has 5 dials on it, which one is he going to try to go for? And do you think it's going to make that much of a difference? It actually probably will make a bit bigger of a difference than you would think, because this one is 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. Okay, so you're going to have about 10,000 possibilities here. If you're wanting to arrange these numbers, 10,000 different possibilities. But if you multiply that by 10 again, just add one more dial, all of a sudden you have 100,000 possibilities. So if a bike thief is going to try to get the right combination, it's not just that a 4-dial lock is a little better than a 5-dial. No, it's a lot better. You have time, if you have a decent amount of time, let's say he's doing it at midnight, so he's got the next 4 hours before he plans on anyone walking by. You know, if he could try about half of these combinations, he might have a decent chance of randomly stumbling upon the correct combination. And then as you add more and more dials, the problem is you multiply it by 10 every time, and it just gets to the point where if you had a lock that had 10 dials on it, that thief has no chance of getting the bike lock undone. There's just no chance. There's no way he could search even a small fraction of the number of possible combinations there. So I give you that example because I want you to be thinking about this in terms of DNA and proteins. But before you see what the responses to some of these arguments are going to be, you need to understand this example. So let's ask a question real quick. What do you think would increase the thief's chances? I mean, how could we help our thief out if he has this ginormous lock and he's just trying all these different combinations? Well, the first one is if he had more time. I mean, if this guy has, 3 days just to sit here and try combinations, the more time he has, the more likely he is to get that lock undone. Or what if this was a lock that had more than one combination that could work? For example, what if on every dial, instead of saying there was only one correct number, you had 3 correct numbers? Okay, so you still have a lot of combinations to pick through, but now there are more possibilities, more correct combinations that you could potentially hit, and so that'll increase your chances. And then also the easiest way, this thief could get through, you could give him 100 dials, but if he could just flip through one, and every time he got to the right number, there was something that told him it was right, he could get through even 100 locks very easily. Just step by step, small incremental steps, and it'd be great. So, now let's take a look at proteins. How does this work with proteins? Because you're asking yourself the idea, what would happen if we just started having mutations searching randomly for different proteins or sequences of DNA? And it turns out that the probability for doing this is so astronomically out of control that random mutations could never actually find the proteins that they're looking for. If you take just an average length protein, okay, that's 300 amino acids. There are 20 possible amino acids in each spot. So if you look at this, that's 20 raised to the 300th power. That would be 10 raised to the 390th power, which is a number that's just incomprehensibly large. There's no way we can get our minds around that. Different possibilities for a protein this size. In other words, different combinations of amino acids. So the question is, this would be like that ginormous bike lock, but this is not exactly what evolutionists envision when they have evolution of proteins in mind. So can this barrier be overcome? And I want you to be thinking about how the thief could get into that bike lock easier. So go to the next one. What happens with these proteins? If you get a right sequence that works, like a good sequence, they can actually fold up into a specific shape, and that's why proteins work the way they do in your body. They have a very specific shape, and that shape depends on the sequence of amino acids that you have. Next one. This is where we're going to have to skip several because I'm not doing this part. Skip. All right. So here's what's going on. We need to find out what's the likelihood of this actually happening. The first thing that we need to bring up, this was done by evolutionists, but also this guy is an intelligent design proponent, and he did an experiment with a 150 amino acid long protein, where he said that, okay, out of all those possible proteins, which one do I think could actually fold into a successful protein? How many of them? And when he found out that number and estimated it based on his experiments, he still got a number that said only 1 out of every 10 raised to the 74th power of those sequences will be capable of folding into a stable protein. So that's a heck of a lot better than searching 1 out of 10 to the 390th, but that is still an astronomically large number because to give you an idea, there are 10 raised to the 80th power particles, or it's estimated about that many particles in the known universe. And when I say particles, I mean like atom stuff. So this is still a very big search space. And so here's the problem. In evolution, you can think of 2 ways to come up with a new set of DNA or a new protein. You can evolve it step by step from a previously existing protein or a previous set of DNA, or you can just come up with it randomly. So maybe there's a stretch of DNA that's sitting there not doing anything, and you attach you turn it into a gene, and all of a sudden it works and makes a new protein for you. There are these two approaches that we have to figure out what could happen with each one. And the problem is that if you try to tell me that there's a stretch of DNA that's free to mutate, and this is what a lot of evolutionists will say. They'll say that, well, maybe you just have these stretches of DNA, and you can mutate them all you want without natural selection doing anything, and that way they're free to mutate all they want, and then you get new genes that way. And the problem with that, and obviously this is a very oversimplified picture, because I'm rushing through this, and like I said, you guys probably don't have the biology to get the details. But the point is that if you have any kind of process where natural selection is not playing a role, you are literally trying to search that 1 out of every 10 raised to the 74th power. And the chances of you stumbling by chance alone on a functional protein sequence that way is just, it's nearly impossible. And that's why natural selection is so important in this evolutionary process. So why can't you start with a gene and evolve it into a different gene? Well, here's another problem, because it turns out that natural selection is really good at getting rid of bad things. And so it turns out if you're going from one protein that works really well and you want to evolve it into this protein that does something really well, you normally can't just go straight across, okay? Mutations that happen in this protein first are oftentimes going to degrade its function so that it can get to a sequence where it will rise up to the new function. And so it turns out that as soon as you start degrading function with mutations in this protein to make it worse off at what it was already doing in order to make it better at something else, natural selection tends to get rid of those proteins, not keep them around, because natural selection has no foresight. It can't say, oh, look, there's a goal over here that we can get to if we just get down through this valley and then pass back up to it. And so natural selection tends to not be your friend in these kinds of processes. And let's go to the next one. And another problem is, how many mutations will you need to accomplish some of this? Because if you have, for example, 2 mutations that you need to happen at the same time before natural selection can even work on it, I mean, what if one mutation in a protein doesn't kill its function, or it doesn't really do anything? But after 2 mutations, then, you know, what happens after 2 mutations? Then all of a sudden you start to get this good benefit that natural selection can work with. The problem is the chances of getting simultaneous mutations, or one right after the other when the first one has no benefit, that creates what are called waiting time problems. And the time you have to wait around for just by chance alone for those coordinated mutations to happen that way far surpasses the time that evolution has on the different species. So like one Mark brought up was human evolution waiting time, where we see humans have apparently evolved over a period of 6 million years, but the waiting time to get some of the mutations we need for that is significantly longer than that, even by a lot of evolutionist estimates. So these are the kind of arguments that are going to be brought up, and evolutionists will disagree with me on these, okay? They'll say that, you'll find some that will say proteins aren't really this rare. Doug Axe's experiments are wrong, and that they're actually more common than that. And so this isn't really as big of a problem. They'll say that in terms of natural selection playing no role, sometimes maybe we do have examples where you just have a bunch of random mutations that create brand new genes. Or if you start with a pre-existing gene, maybe you're just, maybe you do have a step-by-step progression that gets you from one protein to another. Because I'll be the first to admit, even as an intelligent design proponent, if you can show me a step-by-step incremental way to get from one protein to another, natural selection will do that. I don't care how complicated, how many mutations, if you can show me incremental step-by-step, natural selection can do that, evolution can happen. So where intelligent design proponents and Darwinists tend to disagree is when we look at the proteins that exist in life today, can we draw those connections? Do we have incremental step-by-steps to get there? Because a lot of intelligent design proponents will say, no, that's not there. You have to pass through those non-functional valleys that natural selection will get eliminate your evolving protein much sooner before it changes. So let's, it's 8 o'clock, so we'll have to go ahead and stop there. Let me summarize this by saying that when you see these arguments, you're going to see that this discussion has moved way past what you've probably seen in your textbooks. You've seen Darwin's finches, you've seen the peppered moths, you've seen all this stuff, and what I'm telling you is that those examples, they're interesting, But the discussion right now is really on a molecular level. And that's why, if you're wanting to read some of what intelligent design is really having to say today, you're going to have to get out those popular textbook examples. You have to go a little more in depth. And that's what, if you want resources on that, I have some. I'd be more than willing to share them with you, share my thoughts on them. Because like I said, even though I've told you how an evolutionist will respond to these, in my studies so far, I still agree with the points that I've made over the points that they have made. So hopefully this has been slightly educational. Hopefully you stuck with me for most of it. Again, sorry if it was a little technical in parts, but hopefully we all made it through okay. All right, Don.
Told you he was smart. I hope that cleared up some questions. I know I cleared up a couple of questions that have been directed at me. And in the same sense, he talked about moving forward. We have the ability with resources that we can get through Ratio Christi that are free. It talks about intelligent design. It works similar to which this has kind of been like a classroom setting for the past 4 or 5 weeks anyway, but we have, what it would do would give us an 8 to 10 minute video. It'll give you a question and answer, time frame, sheet or whatever, that we can proceed with more basic than what he's presented tonight. It starts from the very, okay, how do you spell intelligent design, and goes from there. Well, because it's such an important process at this point in life, in the secular world. If you want to do that, we can do that. I already have 2 weeks worth available, and the rest of it's supposed to be on the way. Too much information in one night.
What other ideas do you have in mind, sir?
We also talked about Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which is a new and updated book by Josh and Sean McDowell. It used to be by Josh McDowell, but now he and his son have updated it. Will be out, this is what, the 28th? I think by the time we meet again. And we talked about going through it because it's pretty much apologetic related from hello, this is evidence that needs a verdict, to goodbye, thank you, you should be able to go out and have a conversation. Whichever way you want to go, it's going to give you more topics and cover a wider area. Intelligent design is going to give you a way to talk about one of the most popular topics out there, the scientific evolution. And do you see how important it is to define terms? I had this conversation today with a guy, he was an atheist and he converted to Christianity, and he's a biologist, and he and I were talking about the importance of the terms. So I can't stress that enough. Define your terms, even if it sounds stupid. I told you some guy asked me what I meant by new one day. I don't know what you said that. So think about it for the next week. You want to make a decision now, or you want to, we have to know by next Thursday, because we do plan these things, believe it or not. If you can't tell.
You can start a Facebook poll and just kind of leave it open.
Nobody goes to the Facebook page. Actually, some people do. There was 23 people that viewed the one topic, but whatever. Anybody
Can we actually respond to what he said now, or
Anybody?
just
No.
sit up there and win?
No, because we're going to cut this off before we get to that point.
Hey, either way.
Are those people waiting for this room?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Because we
No,
need
I don't think so. We got this room to 8:30.
Oh. Just what can happen?
But we wanted to get it.
Hey, they've been putting you earlier.
You have cookies.
All right, questions, answers, comments?
You're
Please do
doing
cookies.
these. We're not using this one. Stand up there.
Okay.
Just stand up there like Tiny Tim.
All right. Look, I've decided. We'll see how we'll do next week, intelligent design from the basic. See how it goes. If you don't like it, we'll go to the book or some other thing. How's that? That's why I get paid the big bucks. Right. All right. All right. Aaron wants to talk, but we don't want to expose the world to that.
Oh, you're getting likes and hearts. Look at that.